I think believe, and I'm convinced in, the fact that no matter how much knowledge you receive or how much knowledge you give, it's not the spark of the flame for musicianship. It's a fuel, it's a thought process, it's a capacity of analytical understanding, but in the first place, there is something incredible when the ear is connected so fast to the brain, and therefore musically the language that doesn't have obviously words connects directly to the psyche of the person, and they know, they feel, they hear from the inner ear, so to say. Of course, you can give them options like perhaps you should prepare this transition better so you transition without to slow down further and then merge in the traffic of the new theme. Yes, you can say that. It's experience. You can say, be careful, slow movements tend to go slower. Start them less fast, but not too slow, and then connect always the arrival point to your horizon line in order to always have an aim, even at a slow motion. Okay. Is it wrong or right? No, it's not about wrong or right. It's about reflection upon thinking, about analyzation, about comparison. The quartets, the symphonies, the operas of a given composer like Mozart. And then that's why you hear in the piano works. And of course you play it on an instrument he didn't have, and so what? It's marvelous if you do play with the performance practice of the time on an instrument of the time, because you get closer to the ear of the past, this audacity of the daring of a given dissonance, appoggiatura, cacciatura, the choice of a tonality for a development or a slow movement, when things and rules, formally speaking, were so, let's say, not rigid, but followed by so many, let's say, in the early 18th century, 19th century in Western Europe. And then from time to time you have those who dare, but these audacities for the time, outside of the context today, appear lame to most of the students. So how to bring them to contextualize the astonishment, the enmarvelment, the, oh my God. Give you an interesting example. When Beethoven wrote the third concerto in C minor, the second movement is not in the relative E-flat major that would have been the expected, but on the major mediant in E major. And not only does he not prepare for that, but the piano starts a slow movement after the finish of C minor first movement. And so this rapport was at the time obviously provocative of the tonalities. It's colorization, it's not only instrumentation, it's an expression of the positive energy of E major through the color of the tonality compared to the expected E-flat major, which is as bright. Well, some people will argue that because they attribute colors or atmospheres or tastes or whatever you want to put into a specific choice of a tonality for its taste, so to say. And I totally accept that everybody has a different way of appreciating, or not. But if they do, it doesn't have to be through the same filter. It's not the harmony, the melody, the rhythm, the pulse, the articulation, the presentation, the tempo, the pace, the rubato, the ornamentation, the decoration, the pedaling, the phrasing, the direction of the line, the sub-articulation of some sub-phrases like bow changes on the strings. All these that you can implement on the aria or the quartet or the writing that imitates those genres on the piano forte for the early days when it happened in the early 19th century in Viennese school. Wow, all this shopping list of elements, right? It's almost like checklist for a takeoff. And then Sergei Rachmaninoff. They say that he was in a moral law after his morale law, rather, not moral law. Oops, that was interesting. I didn't mean that. I meant to say that they say that he was having a depression because his first symphony performance conducted by Glazunov didn't go well. They attributed to Glazunov being drunk, but who knows? I don't know. I wasn't there. Of course, I don't care. The details, it sounds gossipy. But the interesting product of this possible drama that he lived through as a young composer, for the poor appreciation of his first symphony by the professionals and the audience, is that he went to see a therapist by the name of Dahl, a disciple of, at the time, the novelty of psychoanalysis of Freud in Vienna. And this German Dr. Dahl in Russia gave him as an assignment to write a piano concerto in order to get back in his creative juices, I guess, after the disappointment of that symphony's premiere. And that's how the second piano concerto in this case. In the rapport with the C minor Mozart, or in this case rather Beethoven, which is because I often compare the C minor Mozart Beethoven, but this I compare C minor Beethoven Rachmaninoff to in C minor. And the second movement is in E major also. Of course, we can speculate that is pure coincidence, or perhaps Rachmaninoff modeled on Beethoven's C minor with the second movement in E major, which at that point is less audacious since it's century or two before after Beethoven, or century and a half. But in fact, what is very striking is that old-fashioned Rachmaninoff compared to modernistic Beethoven, if I may purposely oppose them this way provocatively, but with affection, of course. Rachmaninoff feels the need to write a transition that is played by the woodwinds and the strings, and that modulates from C minor in the beginning of the slow movement in order to bring it to E major. Whenever Beethoven directly goes into this, Rachmaninoff, in the modernistic time of the early days of the 20th century, what does he do? He does a transitional. He needs to prepare that arrival of E major. You would think by then music went serial, atonal, and all things at the end of the early 20th century. You could think, okay, that's no need to prepare the ear for it. And when he finishes the second movement, he has another transition. And Beethoven doesn't. He finishes and goes. He uses in harmonically the G sharp, the third of E major as an A flat, to return in C minor. Okay, it's a common tone between the flat 6 of C minor, which is naturally flat degree, A flat precisely, and as well the median's, major median's third. G sharp as a third of E major, and A flat as a ninth of the dominant in C minor. So what does it mean? Does it mean Beethoven was more audacious than Rachmaninoff? Perhaps. Does it mean that Rachmaninoff couldn't dare to do just a drop of tonality that is by then less dramatic, since atonality and all kinds of, let's say, departures from the tonal system that was reigning for so long in the Western Europe was already well on the way. But then you have composers like Medtner, Poulenc, Rachmaninoff, who didn't need to be atonally modernistic, let's put it this way, or post-tonally, using a new language for a new time, or a new language for a new idiom, for a new paradigm, in fact, more than idiom, because it's a language by essence. But I still think that it's interesting to observe what motivated these composers to do these daring things, either very traditional for Rachmaninoff within the 20th century, and thought-provocative and audacious in many aspects for Beethoven in his early or almost mid, well, not really mid because he died in 27, but yeah, early 19th century Vienna. What can I think about it? Tell you the truth, I try to tell my students that they should feel that audacity that perhaps escapes them for having heard and more dissonances and more atonality since Beethoven's time. And so how do we revisit the context of the time in order to appreciate the audacity of it? Make believe? Is it really true? Can we sort of compartmentalize in our brain the different evolutions by perhaps twitching here and there the tonality by some composers, Ravel included, within the 20th century, not to mention Fauré. Little bit of modality, but still with a tonal centered system that has some kind of tension and some kind of release, some kind of effect of appoggiatura, cacciatura, some type of suspension that creates an expectation after a dissonance that becomes expressive at the moment it becomes dissonant, that calls for a consonance. But all these concepts are very dated within a certain period. And the consonances of yesterday are the dissonances of tomorrow, and are rather opposite. The dissonances of yesterday are the consonances of tomorrow. I say it because I don't believe it. Though it's tempting intellectually. Is bitonality by itself so incredibly thought-provoking in the chord of the sacre? Would it be less provoking if it was? Probably not, because I think it was more in the pulse, the rhythm, the expression of the dances in terms of the Rite of Spring's primitivism of early cavemen worshipping in this kind of pagan way the spring and all what it means in rebirth and all this sensuality and all this basically energy of life. Does it have to do to a chordal progression or to a chordal superimposition because you have an E major chord and a dominant of A flat? No, I'm not sure of that. It's difficult, well, actually it's not difficult. It's almost too easy in retrospect to place value of effect, oh wow effect, outside of the time period. And for whichever reasons, is it the traditionality of the audiences of a certain place compared to, let's say, what they expected from a classical ballet in Paris, and they watch this? Is it the ballet more than the music? Is it the octotonic modality of the system that Mussorgsky didn't, but Stravinsky, sorry, I confused the composers' names, but not the styles, of course, introduced? I'm not sure. I think it's probably, people speak about this 1913 May month Champs-Élysées Theatre in Paris, scandalous birth of a modernity, of a revolution. Perhaps all these words are overstated because most of the revolutionary pieces are in fact very subtle, like Jeux by Debussy, like pieces that don't seem to be so iconoclastic, even like breaking the déjà entendu, the expected, the status quo, questioning everything. A two-movement sonata by Beethoven, by itself, it was a big way of giving up on the four-movement sonata Haydn instituted, or allegedly. Probably the whole evolution of stylistic language and therefore contents and its presentation, the vehicle being usually an altered style of tonal system that fit different characteristics of time periods and stylistic specialties, so you don't have any doubt that when you hear Rossini, obviously you don't hear Buxtehude, and when you hear, I don't know, just to take purposely this kind of extreme examples, that most of them, until the atonality arrived in the early 20th century or late 19th, none of these composers for centuries in Western Europe felt the need to get out of it. They felt like they can be personal and in the sense of their style, their personality, their expression, within those grammar rules that they receive. Like they use the language everybody talks and writes in the area, on the place, in the time where they're alive. Now, of course, that is fascinating that some need to rethink the paradigm, they rethink the everything, not just how you organize the sounds, how you obtain expression, how you suscitate some kind of emotional, psychological excitement or daydreaming or drive in the listener or the performers themselves shared with the listeners. How living music was important because they didn't have, in the 19th century, until the 19th century, they didn't have the way to storage music. Let's say music was an expedited commodity of every day, of which a few of the composers added in incredible meaning, complexity, or in both sincerity, intensity, while it was also ephemeral because they had to survive, and so very often, perhaps that's another of the reasons I try to imagine that didn't trigger to rethink or rejecting the tonal system they all inherited, probably because they didn't have time. So to say, to think outside of the box about the box in which they are. They just had to struggle to survive by writing music which by any chance had to be performed and heard and understood and appreciated and paid by the patrons. So inevitably they wouldn't have to take a chance to write something unless the patron is very avant-gardistic, which was not always the case. There are all these nobles or who inherited money enough not to have to make it by less work, but probably all that. So the composers who were there were like providing live music for the different necessities, teach their children, entertain their parties, play for their religious occasions, compose for all these occasions music. And this music was sort of the soundtrack of the lives of the rich and the famous and the elite of the past, of whom some were even performers themselves, like the King of Prussia with the flute subject for Bach's what became the musical offering. But in any case, the composers themselves, with very rare exceptions, Mendelssohn, Chaussel, both parents of these two were bankers, and therefore and Poulenc, actually, three of them, well, the pharmaceutical companies for Poulenc, they were given sort of, say, life stipend, but they were so eager to work that they didn't waste it in any kind of waste. But they worked very hard, except they didn't have to survive and have a boss. It's basically, they didn't have to earn their survival and didn't have a boss to please. And generously, Mendelssohn recovered Bach, who was forgotten, oddly. Today seems so unthinkable. And Chausson was extremely generous with his father's loans with most of the French Impressionist composers, Debussy and the others. And Poulenc could maintain probably his independence. Perhaps even Jean Francais, in a certain extent, was like that too in the later 20th century. He died only in the 90s. They had independent minds with deep and very deep but very intense inner life, with convictions regardless of which they are politically or societally through the times in which they lived. I mean, nobody chooses when they come on earth. But the fact is that they left some timeless music. So is Rachmaninoff tonal when others were atonal? Yeah. Is Poulenc still sounding like old-fashioned composer in the middle of the 20th century? Yes. Did it? It takes some strengths of energy intellectually to swim against the tide. I don't say they were right and all the others were wrong, or those who are all avant-gardists are right and therefore all the others who are old-fashioned are wrong. Because in a way, once they achieve to write a piece that has such meaning timelessly, so to say, outside of the chronology of events for performers and audience, like Carmen by Bizet and like Rachmaninoff Concerto, for instance, or Poulenc's operas or chamber music, or Jean Francais' music. They're what they are, not for when and where they were. That was more in their timeline, of course. Obviously, the teaching become more professional and less holistic. That's true too. There's something very striking about the French Impressionists, speaking of Debussy, Ravel, Fauré, Dindy, Chausson, and so many more, that they were not Impressionists, which anyway was a derogatory word used by a painting critic in the newspaper Le Figaro when the French group of Monet, Manet were exposing their paintings that reflected the mood of the landscape rather than the photographic landscape. Partly, probably, but not only, because photography started existing, so the factual didn't need to be drawn or painted, but in a way they painted more the mood of what this, let's say, sunset or sunrise or whatever landscape meant to them. And so in French, impression was impressionniste meant something like derogatory. It was considered by these reviewers saying, like, they're sort of like amateurs, a bunch of, they don't know how to paint academically, which they didn't paint academically, obviously. And so the association of the painters of that time period, called the Impressionists, what they called themselves with the name they were accused of by the bad review in the Figaro, was a way to sort of return the bullet and claim that as their act of existence as artists. But in terms of the musicians, would be more symbolists probably, like the poetry at the time, using nature to evoke all the human feelings and spirituality and sensuality and expectation and sadness and hope and joy and sadness through seasons, forests, skies, rain, wind, all the elements of Mother Nature. And then, interestingly enough, in the desire to reconquest the antiquity of Greece and Rome, they restarted actually in France, de Coubertin, the Olympics in 1890s of modern times. And then the desire for more gymnastics, more healthy bodies, that was the beginning of this long trend that today has covered the planet to be healthy, as the Romans used to say, corpore sano mens sano, in a healthy body, a healthy soul. And in that time of revival of the antiquities, and of course you had also the colonial universal exhibits of 1890s, 1880s into 1900 in Paris. It was not yet universalism or today's globalism, mondialisation, as they say in French, but it was a way to in fact, before the means of technology, it was a rare way to get close touch to samples of different, call it cultures or call it demonstration of cultures. It's ambiguous because of the colonialism in it. But let's say that in all this movement of intellectual return to the antiquity, the harp as a music instrument, which was so prominent in the antiquity, became at its rebirth in the end of the early 20th century. And both piano makers, Pleyel and Hérat, were in competition in France, in Paris, with two styles of modern harp. One is entirely chromatic with all the strings for each of the chromatic tones, so a lot of strings. And the other one that functioned with pedals, where you only sharp or flattened certain C's or C sharps, if you had to play in a given tonality with that amount of accidentals or sharps or flats in the key signature. So Ravel wrote for the one commission that was commissioned to him, which was an Introduction Allegro for harp and 6 instruments. And Debussy wrote Danse Exotique, the exotic dances for harp and small orchestra. But then you think, okay, they give the rebirth of the harp, fine. And what did they study in the Paris Conservatory, all these composers between 1880 and 1920s, let's say, roughly, or 1914 because of World War I? Organists. Because all the composition students in the Paris Conservatory had to play organ, it gave them an opportunity to have a job in one of the many churches in Paris and France in general, of course, over 30,000 of them. At least half of them have organs, even if in bad shape from old days, because all the churches anyway are very old. The organs are more recent. But there was a salary for an organist, and so a composer could make a living before becoming capable of earning from his own works. And then the rebirth of the harp. Why do I put these two apparently non-connected events of that revival of the antiquities and at the same time the instrument becoming a modern instrument, better projecting, better keeping its tune, which is not also relative for harpists. And when they write for piano and they're organists, and they don't have a middle pedal like on the piano to keep portion of things and then play other things separately without to get all messy, like this. But they did write on 3 staffs mostly, with a bass, a middle notes, and then some kind of, as if they had 3 hands, but they only had 2 pedals on the pianos at that time in France. So they write organ-like, because they study composition, of course they study polyphony, contrapoint. I mean, all students of music learn the grammar of music, especially if they become, if not theorists, composers as well. And then the harp, with the resonance and not the dampers, and just this kind of precision in the plucking of the note, and then this kind of sound halo that is so beautiful to the harp. And I find that when you listen to the texture of the piano music written by the French composers of that time period, around the beginning of the 20th century, most of it is a harp organ combination, imaginary one. And you have this kind of big basses, and you have harp are 2 powerful instruments that in fact are very complementary and put together in an imaginary of a composer. The length of sound, but the precision of the detail, the thinness of the resonance and the thickness of the length of sound of the organ. It's like the piano becomes a harp organ. And that's how I think I can most after so many decades, not define nor belittle, but kind of describe the texture and the sensual texture of the pianos that they had on which they composed. In every time period, every composer has a specific genre in mind that makes him or her very productive. Mozart is operas, and everything he wrote is operatic, regardless if it's trio, solo piano, or a church piece. Tchaikovsky obviously was a ballet composer, a narrative storytelling music, incredibly capturing the events of the moods of the situations, captivating. And then everything else he wrote became, in the other genres, the other style, not styles, but the other instrumentation genres, was that. So you recognize that. Bach was an organist and polyphonist, regardless if he wrote church music or solo instrument, harpsichord, or organ. Organ probably more so. But not only. But still, I think it was his signature. And of course, who can deny that the three Chopin, Liszt and Mendelssohn were not incredible pianists? The only one who wasn't in that group is Schumann. But he had Clara to prophetize and then continue his legend as a musician. And not all the composers do it through the fingers. I mean, Beethoven, probably quartetist, I would say, even for the symphonies and the sonatas. I think he's incredible need of quartet texture when he thinks music, regardless if it's for piano, for whatever. Does it fit for every composer that there is a specific genre that defines their creativity, where they're most sincere, believed, or achieving the greatest direct touch to our soul, hearts, and whoa? Perhaps not. Perhaps some are a little bit more versatile and some could be considered. Poulenc is very difficult to define because he wrote chamber music, church music, choral music, and then chanson music, very light music in terms of the mood. A very eclectic approach instead of a very focused approach or a very professionalized approach. Perhaps a delicious dilettante. Delicious is not the right word, it's a false cognate, but some kind of a touche à tout is the French word. Jack of all trades and master of none. That's a little bit more elaborate in English, but it could be the translation. It takes so much culture to filter, not only study, but by curiosity, by opportunity, by keeping an open soul to the things that you might think, that's not for me, or I'm not going to understand it, or this opera is too long for me, or this music language of Messiaen is too much with this or that. Okay, perhaps there's time for different time periods. Perhaps that's my great regret. Beethoven, Schubert didn't have much exchange, except one way. Beethoven inspired Schubert, but I don't think Beethoven, or what I know, knew much about Schubert. And if he did, thank God, it might have helped for this second movement of 90. Perhaps he did, after all. It's incredible. I mean, in a certain way, you can say Haydn was inspired by Mozart, writing incredible sonatas after Mozart died, after having been his musical father, so to say. Sometimes the influence doesn't go always in the hierarchy that you expect, in the asymmetrical situation of the mentor, the teacher, and the student, or the younger. I find that all that fascinating because I hear in some students that they sort of understood all of that without even to have gone through it. Is it just the power of intuition, their genetic material, their ear not only hearing but guessing the right intuition that supplants in a way or shortcuts all this knowledge, that in a way it's more hierarchized and more step by step thought process instead of the intuitive, which is sort of like a wave that overtakes you. And I think my greatest teacher's worry is not to over inform, so to say, the student case by case, person by person, character by character, personality by personality, culture by culture, no general cases, but generally being so respectful of the personality of the student, because they bring something not only new by the essence of the fact that they come after you, so they are newer, but they bring another point of view. Doesn't have to be new per se. Perhaps it's young and still old-fashioned, or older and more modernistic, regardless of how you position the cursor on what is what and what corresponds to what in the evolution of an art form. Yeah, the more I age, the more as a teacher I realize that, wow, nothing beats intuition. And so my greatest worry is not to overstate the understanding of things in order not to take away ultimately this necessary, if not mystery, unexplained reason for which the charm of a melodic line just overtakes you. And you don't have to always explain it. I mean, okay, you spend your time in scholar situations to dissect, explain, analyze, but you don't really explain. You sort of define, but you really don't explain. Some dare to say that's because of this, a causality that reaches this, which touches that. And yes, you can say some composers borrowed, some stole, perhaps some were influenced subconsciously or inconsciously, the others consciously, and regardless, it's, I mean, who am I to judge? Besides, I don't. But since I like to think freely outside of the box, while I respect incredibly the details of the composer's wishes, which I play, perform, teach, or in both forms, but it doesn't stop me from having, I don't find it at least, contradictory to think outside of the box freely and say, wow, he could have gone there. So Beethoven writes at the end of his third concerto, first movement, the scales repeating the C, which pianistically is awkward because pianists are always afraid he won't repeat. So if he had just done, then it would have been logical pianistically. Of course, musically I find it lame, rather than the insistence of the repeated note is so Beethovenian. Ha ha! Okay, well, I can say that was the cause or the origin of the situation, or is it just that he miscalculated the number of notes? He could have started and then finish on the downbeat by starting an earlier note on the C and not having to repeat it. But you know, okay, what does it help? Nothing, except it gives you the chance to allow yourself to think a bit out of the box. Okay, the score is important, the source material, the authenticity, whatever that means. Well, it means a lot, but obviously it doesn't mean always the same to many, or at all for some, because they thought they just bring their personality to the piece instead of serving the piece as a recitant of a score that is claiming to be the original emanation of the original, and how much the intent is not, or is rightfully translated through the notation. I, as a teacher, can tell you, wow, no, not much. And I think most teachers will say that, except that we build up some kind of experience that gives us the sense of saying, yeah, the ornaments are played this way for that time period and this for that time period. And with the exception of this and that, when the same note comes, you cannot play it from above. So in fact, the more you put explanations, the more you put exceptions, the more you confirm the rule, the more you realize it's case by case. And perhaps it's because we are in a time period where we play so many different time periods of the past compared to the past that never played but their own, or had little access to outside of their own, from their own past. And was it life expectancy? Was it just the fact of having to earn quickly money and not have the luxury to have long studies if they can find scholarships or sponsors or patrons? The time is different today. In a way, we study longer, but we are more specialized, and they studied less, or just basically copy the piece, learn how it's made out of observation, just like you do for a craftsman, how you do a chair. I'm going to make it like you, then I'm going to innovate, I'm going to add another leg or something. I don't want to belittle it, but I don't think that they studied so thoroughly as we do today, and let less having access to so much music of their own past as we do. Does it inhibit, or does it censor some to develop their own creativity? Probably. But not only. I think you can be as creative recreating the past, as creative as inventing a new tonal system, or a new model of system, or the new organization of notes, or just use the regular ones to organize them in a way that is what it is that it means to you, and it's charming or deep or meaningful or expression, or I don't know. Not everybody can agree, but it's a language of its own when it's not attached to words by essence. But I find that in the teaching process, the students teach me a lot, because they don't have all these preconceived experiences, obviously, or preconceived thoughts that these experiences brought you to do, like how much rubato, but don't do this, but try to avoid that because the structure, because the tempo, but the different character of the stylistic motivic elements, but in the same tempo, because it's a structural composition, therefore it has to be having the balances like an architect of an ephemeral structure that you build in front of the audience while you tell them the story through the thematic material, instead of just the thematic material by itself, which becomes the romantic era into the modernity, where they have no more form, just directly. Yeah. And so why I was sharing with you how much I find, no matter how much I share the knowledge I received, or which I developed with my own curiosity since my teacher died 40 years ago, we all evolve. We're not like just the time period when we were. It's like just different season of life. You rediscover pieces you knew in different light, because somehow the student brings it to you, and you see through the students, perhaps as I said, subconscious, not even aware that they're renewing the interpretation of it. Of course, it's easy to say you're wrong because I'm right and I'm in hierarchy above you, and you came to study with me. I know you don't, so the recipient is filled one way. No. I think we should be more humble. It's easy to say, difficult to do. Or let's say a self to apply to oneself. True humility and true openness, and at least without negating your own convictions. After all, you're a human who has lived a certain time on earth, and you have received this or that as a information, influence, seduction, and you pass it around. I mean, it's a chain, of course, of generations. As ephemeral as everything is, some things persist and they go through the generations, and some are lost, some are rediscovered, some evolve. Ravel was right when Gershwin met him, Biltmore Hotel in New York, wanting to study with him. He wrote to my teacher, both of them were Fauré students, so he trusted her as a teacher because she was more teaching than him. He really didn't teach. Would you have the courage? I don't have to teach him what he wishes to have, because if we give it to him, we might break his intuition. Jazz. Broadway? Do you have to know how to write a fugue to write a Broadway musical? Perhaps it doesn't directly need to be that, but it could be an ingredient, or it could be unnecessary. Do we always learn something towards a trade? No, but sometimes it's general culture. You practice scales, but you're not going to find them always in the pieces as such, but you practice them theoretically. Same with keyboard harmony. Through sequences, you learn on the keyboard how to organize the functions in every tonality's different topography. So yes, this is what I think teaching is about, is giving you the capacity for the student by themselves to rethink the paradigm. Of course, it's very agreeable, to put it mildly, when a student pleases you by adopting your suggestion of an interpretation, a dynamic range, or something specific right away. And then students goes, is that how you like it? And you go, oh, that's good now. But does it mean that the student understands how all that enters in the structure of the ecosystem of his music expression of this piece? Probably not, because it's all just manipulating one detail or another by saying, I like it better, or the tradition says, or my teacher told me, or this edition that, or I see in the manuscript suggests that. And regardless if you give any explanation other than just I like it like this or play like me, which to an extent it's really taught mostly like that, but it's okay, because there is a trust between the student and the teacher, even if the student can and will choose other inspirations from other people, regardless if it's right away or later or at the same time, because of the availability today of recorded performances that even my generation when I was a student didn't have. And again, I go back to that point, over-information, over-intelligence, transmission of knowledge, thought process, food for thought, understanding, avoiding shortcuts to avoid this in order to prepare you to go more to the heart of things, rather than say, oh, he or she will figure it out. After all, I did take me how many years to figure out what is an andante in Schubert, or what is a Allegro in Beethoven, and what is a sforzando in Beethoven, and how do I understand it, how do I play it, how do I explain it, how do I live it, how do I construct it, how do I embody it in my complete understanding. That's the culture, the cultivated playing of a given composer's culture and style. So can you just translate that just like packages of knowledge? You know, that's the style, that's the genre, this is the interpretation, this is the performance practice, this is a translation on the modern instrument, this and that according to the instrument, but also the composers thinking beyond the instrument, or through the instrument, rather for the instrument. None of the composers were frustrated with the instruments they had. They were very happy with the instruments they had. We think, perhaps I think that we do sometimes, bit arrogantly, that, oh, the harpsichordists thought their sound is short and their dynamics didn't exist. That's not true. That's how we think of them, but that's like altering chronology of history and reading a past through the understanding of today. That's not right. If you really want to understand the context, bathe in it, immerse yourself in it, and then come out of it and then contradict it and play it with your opinion on the piano. After all, Busoni did that with Bach. Today people would be more respectful and afraid to be doing a paraphrase of a piece. Even a transcription seems to be, oh my God. We're so afraid of getting outside of the tracks that are in the score, because that's what is expected in the juries, in the auditions, in the exams, in the competitions. The alikeness of the globalization of our texting. So we recite with the fear of the wrong note, and that's a very low denominator. But what about the phrase direction, the meaning, the style, the expression, regardless of the right or wrong note, which is not incompatible. You can play clean and musical, not instead of. But very often, in order to play clean, you have to play repetitive practicing, and the repetitive practicing is boring. And therefore, some people who don't have enough patience or capacity to to repeat enough until it becomes in the muscular memory. Then they cannot be precise in certain things that they cannot control in real time during the performance, let less the unexpected of the stage that you have to manage because of stage fright or whatever reasons. You love the piece too much, you're afraid you're going to break it, and because you love it so much, you're afraid of playing it, or because you're afraid of betraying it. But ultimately, teaching is liberating, giving some technical aspects with fingerings, phrasing, pedaling, ways that you give the student the conviction that no matter what, the unexpected of the instrument of the day, the acoustics, all things that have to be taken in account in real time during the performance can be managed. Because you have a vision as a conductor of the piece, and then you have practiced enough to have a certain autoplay or autopilot, and then you manage, and if you had a mistake, you try to still stay ahead. As long as your brain is ahead of what you play, you can organize the arrival of the point or the transition, how the bridge goes into the next. I mean, thematic materials are beautiful, but the bridges are the ones that valorize them. And how you negotiate them in your interpretations is as important as the quality of the legato of the aria of a second theme, or the driven, let's say, staccato of a first theme if it's for the contrast purpose. I think all that, and when I hear a student, I try to select of all these options of knowledge and transmission and necessary awareness, which one I'll choose for which student, in which piece, for which repertoire, at which time of their development, hoping to touch the right point at the right moment in order to help them progress for themselves, not just hope that they will imitate how I play, because that is on the surface, is like the iceberg without visualizing all what makes it underwater. Though it's rewarding, as I said earlier, for the teacher, but that's not the point. The point is, do you play beautifully or meaningfully? And what is meaningfully? Is it thematically? Is it formally? Is it expressively? And how much expression involves how much dynamics of phrasing, articulation, perhaps rubato, perhaps not, and what tempo and what structure and what group of bars for the section, and then all of a sudden you change mood because the staccato goes from tenuto to drier, and it becomes comic when it was anxious. And staccato and tenuto in a given tempo, good acoustic and given piano becomes almost alike, or the dotted rhythm, if it's overdotted, becomes a grace note, underdotted is a triplet. Tension, release, pulse, harmony, melodic lines, all these elements of the crossword puzzle in which we are plunged in, some kind of a maze go through the piece. And even if you play it often, you go through the same routine, but then some things appear differently because the instrument brings it on a different acoustic differently out, and you go, wow, I never heard this inner voice. Never thought about this into this. Even after how many years I rediscover in the second, third revisitation, oh my God, this imitation. Or perhaps I can creatively create it, even if it's embedded without to be indicated with a stem, up or down. Again, is the intent of the composer really meant in the notation of the publisher? I beg to differ sometimes. I think that it's not all said in so clearly, or so definitely, or so detailedly, that we have no room but to be alike in order to be correct, or therefore hopefully close to what the composer wished. And as a teacher, I'm between the dead composer and the living student. Is a hyphen situation. It's hard because I guess as well as they do, I have more flying hours, as they say, for airline pilots. But still, that doesn't give me the advantage of having thought from all points of view. And they bring me a different point of view, and I try to integrate it and think, no, perhaps, but why not? And perhaps this way. And if you do this, it brings you to that, and then all of a sudden you have another suite of thoughts that bring you to another paradigm of the piece, in fact. And that's beautiful. You have to embrace that. Takes a lot of guts to accept that perhaps all of your life you heard, thought, you understood the piece, perhaps if not wrongly, at least one way, and you realize that there is another way. Is it because you were stubborn when you were younger that you try to solidify and go to the next piece? Because by the time you learn all the repertoire, which you will never, because it's too much and not enough for a lifetime on the piano. But you become having some, you know, you start thinking that you know. That's dangerous. And it's easy to say, false modesty. In fact, I think it's the hardest thing to do is to accept to have an open mind. Mademoiselle Boulanger told me when I was a very young child, when I started studying with her, and I was like all children, oh, I don't like this composer, I don't like that piece. I mean, of course, what does a 7-year-old know in terms of knowledge other than feel or intent? My intuition must have been obviously very driven then, very strong. My antennas were up, so to say. She didn't stifle me in that, or the contrary. She told me, if you don't like a piece, don't say I don't like it. Tell yourself, I don't understand it, intellectually saying so. And then try again later. Perhaps you'll find another way in. It's a difficult legacy, Mademoiselle Boulanger, because Mademoiselle Boulanger used to say something like, be intransigent, forgive less with yourself, and very tolerant with the others. So easy to do the opposite. Criticize everybody and be accepting one's, you know, failures. Like, it's okay, I'm tired, or... There's always an excuse. Easy for oneself. And it's easy to criticize the others. Oh, they don't know what they're doing. Oh, they don't know the style. Oh, they don't play the right tempo. It's not what's supposed to be. I know the tradition. They don't, blah, 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 blah. Perhaps some of it is true in all of that. I don't say I reject it all. Because it would be, of course, not subtle and intellectually I was going to say fragile, but perhaps it's not that word. Vulnerable and subtle, yeah, subtle. I think the subtlety is to have convictions and have open mind. If not, why do you teach? Not just to recite what you know, what you think, and what you already decided that you know, but it's an interaction with the student's opinion of the piece. I don't always put it on the same level, because after all, the knowledgeable has some superiority on the spot by the essence of the transmission situation, but in reality, not really. Chamber music is more shared, even if some teach more the others while they play. So they're playing more than explaining. But when you teach, you have to explain. Once you start putting words to things that you never thought you could word or put words on because they're unexplainable. In a way, if music could be explained, it won't be its own language. After all, we can explain how it affects us, but by analyzing what it is and how it's written. But ultimately, we are redundantly explaining the explanation that reflects the reflection of the piece, which in fact doesn't need words. You copy it, you play it, you mustn't or fully understand it. Perhaps you understand it better later again, or differently, or still not. But be prepared to like, and if you don't, as she told me, try again and say, not I don't love it, or I don't like it, but I don't understand it. And let the door open, the intellectual door open. It's difficult to live up to those standards. Probably I failed most. But regardless, it's not about me, it's about the students. I talk to you today, but when I teach the students, it's not about me, it's about them. I put all of my drive, understanding, hearing, and intention of helping them with this or that to reach this or that, that becomes then their territory, and they develop it from their own. It's not just spoon-feeding the meaning of the piece. In a way, you really can't. You only can help them focus, sharpen, add this or that spice to the sauce, or less or more. It's probably an unfinishable and unfinished job to help develop another musician. The transmission is not so much only in data, knowledge, experience. That's factual. In fact, it's more in the innuendo, in the way of behaving in a phrase, in the integrity that you put in the choices of your phrase traction and how you go through the line, and you say, oh, this is more that and this less that, you know. Sometimes you surrender, you succumb rather to temptations, and sometimes you stay alert and say, no, not for me. Too much rubato. Not enough rubato. But not for Ravel, who said, one doesn't play interpretation of my music, one plays my music, period. As if, for some composers like him, at least the way he spoke about it, interpretation was by essence a betrayal. It's not true. It's a revisitation. It's in fact loving the piece differently than the composer, the author. It's not against the author's opinion, perhaps it's a different way. It is a different way. Is it the only way? Is it right or wrong? I don't think in right or wrong. Perhaps there are margins of error that is obvious when the character of a piece is specifically I cannot play a funeral march very fast and happy, unlike, well, you could if you wanted to make a sarcastic standpoint of perhaps. See, even that I try to stay open-minded to. But this is speculation that's unnecessary. Anyway, very talkative, as you noticed. And I should perhaps no more talk. Just listen.